Hello, this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Welcome to this edition of the SpeechCast. It's a joint venture with the Jewish journals, The Speech Project, and my partner, Monica Osborne, is the editor of the Speech Project, and she'll be the co-host for today's SpeechCast. We're very fortunate to have with us Batya Ungar-Sargon, who is the deputy opinion editor of Newsweek. And she's also co-host of the podcast, The Debate, that's Newsweek's podcast. And she's author of Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, which is a very timely topic that I'm sure we are going to explore. So Batya, thank you so much for being with us.
It's really an honor for me to be here speaking to both of you. I admire both of you so much. So thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, let's get to it. So I first came across you when you were opinion editor at The Forward. And I remember an article that you had written about heterodox Black voices that had been sort of underrepresented in the conversation. And I have to tell you, as someone who was reading those authors at the time and very frustrated that the organized Jewish community was not willing to listen to them, it was like a godsend to read that. Yet, I know you also got a lot of flack for it. So tell me about that episode and what it sort of meant in your time at The Forward and beyond.
So I wrote a few articles about that, actually. I think that there was this sort of moment before, and now we've sort of solidly entered overcorrection zone. But there was a moment where I did feel like the communal conversation that we were having was there was a sort of almost moral panic around intermarriage. And that sort of, post the Pew study from 2013, there was this real focus on intermarriage as a sort of like huge moral panic, the main threat to the Jewish community. And I really sort of resisted that. I felt like it did not reflect where the younger generation of Jews were at, where their energy was at. I knew a lot of converts, Jews by choice, who felt that their experience was not being represented. And for a while, there was a sense that Black Jews were really bringing that conversation and that energy to the forefront in terms of challenging our notions about what a Jew should look like, what a Jewish experience should look like. Mm-hmm. So I really felt like it was important to foreground those voices. And that's really what we were doing at The Forward when I was there, trying to find as many voices of underrepresented people relevant to our conversation, be them Black Jews, be them Muslims, be them Palestinians, be them Orthodox Jews, even settlers who you don't often hear in their own voice. So really trying to elevate the voices of people who you don't hear from, who the current power structures really do not reflect their experience.
But then you wrote about the John McWhorters and the Coleman Hughes and that group as the conversation started to develop. Wasn't that didn't that create a controversy?
It did create a controversy. The piece I wrote before that created even more of a controversy. I feel that we have entered into, as I said, overcorrection zone. So, among white liberals, this has been happening for a while. Sociologists refer to it as the Great Awakening. There was a moment, it started really to percolate around 2011, 2012, and just sort of really escalated recently, where white liberal opinion began to outpace in its liberalism around issues of identity, specifically minority communities. And that sort of became amplified more and more through the media. I write about this in my book. And then also in the wake of George Floyd's horrific murder, it really became the kind of lingua franca of the moment. And because the left has such a lock on the culture, has complete sort of capture on American culture right now, it has become the dominant paradigm of our moment. So I wrote about a group of Black intellectuals who are pushing back against this. I call it wokeness. People also call it anti-racism. It comes from critical race theory and academic discipline that's been mainstreamed through the liberal media. And I was super interested in how these intellectuals, not all of them identify as Black, although they would accept that they have all had the experience of being Black in America. It's very subtle. I wanted to hear the ways in which they were pushing back on this new language that insists on a kind of racial essentialism. And it's so interesting because they span the political spectrum. They really agree on very little except on this. And it was very important to me to represent that as well, the ways in which they disagree about these topics. It's not a monolith by any means, but there is a consensus around this idea that the new language of racial essentialism, anti-racism, is not only dehumanizing to people of color and insulting, but is actually dangerous to society.
Yeah, so how did that ideological environment that you're talking about that shifted the overcorrection, how did that affect your work at the Forward? Can you talk about that? Or was that a factor in you deciding to sort of leave the Jewish community? I mean, I'll just ask point blank, okay? What can I say? Or did you decide for other reasons that it was time to go?
I'm so impressed with you just putting it out there.
No, why not? What do I have to lose? I've self-canceled, so what do I have to lose, right?
You're like, I'm gonna do it every time you get the chance. I left the Forward because I was offered a position at a mainstream publication where I felt I could have a bigger impact. It's a much bigger platform. The audience at Newsweek is, indescribably bigger than the Forward. So I left to pursue a bigger platform because I feel that America really needs to be having this conversation. And Newsweek has completely leaned into the idea of the debate. Go check out our podcast, The Debate, at newsweek.com. We debate every week, 2 liberals, 2 conservatives. It's great. And they are really leaning into this idea of hosting the broad spectrum, civil discourse and debate. I will say, I do feel that the liberal Jewish community is in a moment of extreme crisis around more. It is in a crisis of moral authority, specifically stemming from wokeness and the racial conversation that we're having in America. I feel that the Jewish community right now is going through something similar to what Shelby Steele described the white liberal community going through in the 60s. And beyond the white community, he argued that, in the wake of the civil rights movement, there was this crisis in moral authority as white Americans realized that they had done something indescribably terrible. And I feel that the Jewish community right now is in a crisis of moral authority around race. They have lost their sense of self. They have lost the idea of what it means to be a Jew. And the reason this happens is because in the anti-racism woke critical race theory model, there's no sort of objective sense of morality. The left today has replaced morality with power. They only recognize power as whether you have it or you don't. So power has become powerlessness has become the moral position of our time, right? Which is evidenced by your position, you're belonging to a marginalized group. And what this means is that a person who has more power, who is less marginalized, no longer has the right to a moral position in society. That right has to be ceded to a person with less power. And what that means is that Jews who 92%, according to the latest Pew study, say they identify as white, all of those Jews feel that the liberals no longer have the right to, their own moral position in a sense of I know what is right and what is wrong. I know the difference between this and that. You have to cede that now to people of color who are considered to be more marginalized. And I totally reject that. I mean, I think our job as Jews is, it's just to distinguish right from wrong. So I do feel that the Jewish community, the liberal Jewish community, is in a moment of crisis, and we really need to be having this conversation. So I'm really grateful that you're having me on, and I know that you guys are interested in these topics as well. So I'm grateful to you for speaking up.
Monica.
Yeah. So this is all great, Batya. And I've been a fan of yours for a long time. I followed your career at the Forward, and, I saw, when there was a turn against you by some people, and, I followed that with, a real righteous anger on your behalf, even though I didn't know you at the time. And I have, so many of the heterodox Black thinkers that I now read almost religiously, I was exposed to because of pieces you wrote or talks that you moderated. Camille Foster, for example, you moderated a talk with Isaac Bailey, John McWhorter, and Camille Foster, which I thought was just fantastic. This was a number of months ago.
It's pronounced Camille. He will be the first to admit it's spelled not to reflect that. But yes, Camille Foster, Isaac Bailey, and John McWhorter, every single one of those people is just fabulous. And I rely on them. And I just want to give a shout out to Isaac, because Isaac is sort of more in the anti-racist camp. And you should all buy his book. It's called My Brother Moochie. He grew up in South Carolina, one of many, many children. 3 of his brothers have been to prison at this point, one of them for killing a white man. And he writes about, overcoming guilt. He writes about, the difference between the good Black people who they allow out and the bad Black people. And he is one of the people on the left who I consider to be a moral beacon, who I am always, when I'm writing, when I'm thinking through these topics, I'm not picturing those people who tried to cancel me over and over and tried to get me fired over and over. Like, they don't exist to me. I'm writing to Isaac. Like I have the people who I consider to be the moral center of the left, who are not at all reflective of the movement more generally. But if I can't convince them, if I can't convince myself that I did the best to respond to them, I've just picked a new side. You know what I mean? And to me, that's kind of like worthless. And so I'll just add this, which is that, when I talk about like about wokeness and anti-wokeness, I think it's really important to emphasize, caring about police brutality. That's not wokeness. That's not anti-racist. That's something every good American should do. And we're lucky to live in a moment where even Republicans now are picking up the call for this. So it's like, it's not woke to care about Palestinian civil rights in the West Bank. Like, that's important. That's something that, every human of conscience should care about. So like that distinction between like the correction and then the overcorrection is like super important. But I interrupted you, Monica. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. Interrupt me as much as you want. And I think part of the problem, and I think this is what you're getting at, is that the woke community has kind of hijacked these causes as their own. And so anybody who doesn't consider themselves, part of the woke crowd, they don't necessarily feel like they can participate in, working toward Palestinian rights or Palestinian solidarity or taking better care of that community, while also, insisting that Israel deserves to exist as a Jewish state. The nuance is lost with everything. And this is a tremendous problem. But what I was going to say, and this is going back to some of these Black heterodox thinkers that are so phenomenal. And, I will say with Isaac, I've had a few Twitter exchanges with him, and I don't always agree with him, but I have a deep respect for his perspective. And I appreciate that he will engage in thoughtful conversations with people he doesn't agree with. And I think also, if we're going to talk about, fighting against what we're calling illiberalism, if we're going to fight against, the suppression of heterodox voices, we have to engage in these conversations with people too, and not just, pull into our orbits the voices with whom we agree. And that can be hard. But of course, you're doing this at Newsweek with the debate, which I think is just fantastic. And but I guess, again, I'm sidetracking myself now. I want to go back to 2 things that you just spoke about. The first one is the idea of liberalism. You're talking about the liberals, the liberal left. One of the things that I've been doing, and I'm not even sure how accurate it is to do this, but I've really been talking about the left as almost two different parties at this point, liberals and progressives, because I see most of these woke sensibilities as part of the progressive group as opposed to the liberal group. So personally, I've really been trying to make that kind of distinction. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what those kinds of distinctions mean to you.
Okay, so two things. First of all, I want to push back against you saying that they've hijacked these issues. So the woke position over the summer was defund the police, abolish the police, right? 81% of Black Americans, when you ask them how much time should the police spend in my neighborhood, said the same amount of time or more, right? Like it is on us as journalists, as thinkers, as thought leaders to find out how these communities actually feel. The people, braying for abolishing the police, their moral authority comes from the fact that they ostensibly are representing the community most impacted by police brutality, the Black community, right? Now, but they're not, right? And that's on us to make that point and not to cede that ground. And same thing with Palestinian rights. Like, who is more likely to bring about civil rights for Palestinians in the West Bank? Someone insisting that 8 million Palestinians be allowed to move to Israel, or somebody saying like, no, we need to get back to, the two-state solution, or, we need to find another solution, people on the ground actually talking to Israelis and Palestinians, right? So I think that's on us not to cede the moral ground. And that's my problem with the liberal Jewish community right now, is I feel that it is capitulated, exactly like you said. It's allowed these issues to be hijacked when actually the people acting as though they're speaking on behalf of the disenfranchised and the objects of police brutality are not, and that's where my anger is coming from. Like, I actually really care about these problems and they are actually solvable. And I believe that I am closer through interviews, through spending time in these communities, through talking to these people. I feel that I am closer to solving them. So I think that is like, I would urge us to be a little more outraged, I mean, outrage is bad. It's bad for discourse. It's bad for everything. But I feel a little bit like there's a deficit of outrage on the anti-woke side, if you will. Okay, the two parties. It's so interesting because the progressive side, on the one, yes, I agree with you that there's sort of two camps. There's the sort of far left camp, and then there's the liberal camp that was supposed to be able to withstand it, that used to withstand it. People like Nancy Pelosi, who used to be able to give resounding condemnations of anti-Semitism, and now is kind of, and now that sort of middle center camp has sort of capitulated to the progressives on issues of identity. But I kind of like, I mean, I make this mistake a lot as well in language, but I don't even think the progressives are left. Like, left to me is socialist. Like, I'm left because I'm a socialist, because I think that the most important problem in America is income inequality and the lack of dignity for every person in this country, and the huge class chasm that's opened up between people with a college degree and people without it. Like, that's left to me. Like, caring about how the CEO of Goldman Sachs speaks, or caring about like the banner on Amazon, or caring about whether the children in some elite school are being taught that they're white supremacists in a class that they can then put on their transcript to get into Harvard, or caring that these elite public schools are too white instead of caring that they exist at all. That is not left to me. Like, a left proposal is not, how do we get more kids of color into this elite school? I mean, yes, that is important. There should be, to the extent that elites exist, they should be much more diverse than they are. But the reason they're not diverse is not because of racism. It's because of classism, and because this country hates the poor. So to me, it's sort of like, I'm like, yeah, there's something percolating in the progressive wing that is extreme and bad for this country, and that liberals have totally capitulated to. But a little bit, I resist like the designation of left, because left is supposed to be about like caring about the dignity of the bottom, like it's populist, it's like, but these people are not. They care about the dignity of the people at the top. And like, look, I care, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's bad. Like, microaggressions are bad. They are. I'm not going to like deny that. But is it a left proposal to like obsess over the microaggressions of the elites, as opposed to like getting rid of the huge gap between the elites and everybody else? I don't think so. So that's kind of how I would respond to that.
That's really interesting. It feels like no matter where you look at the political spectrum, there's this seismic kind of shifting of categories and designations.
Totally.
And I feel like every day I'm trying to figure out what it means to be left, or to be liberal, or to be progressive, or even to be conservative or a centrist. Some of these Black heterodox thinkers that I brought up, most of them are staunchly on the left. I mean, they're Democrats, right? Or they're liberal thinkers. They're not conservatives. I mean, most of them are.
I would say half and half. Yeah. But I think it's another interesting point. Like, to me, the Trump phenomenon really gets at this, because I I feel like Trump was, first of all, he was a populist, but second of all, a lot of his economic policies were actually very protectionist in nature. And they were the kinds of things that people like Bernie Sanders had been calling for, like in his 2015, 2016 run, and then Trump showed up and actually did some of them, like renegotiating NAFTA and like caring about a strong border, and this trade war with China. This is all stuff that people who used to be progressive in the economic sense used to talk a lot about. But because of the sort of the class disgust with Trump, because he was so gross, because he offended our sensibilities as elites, our aesthetic sensibilities, like literally Bernie Sanders had to go out there and start calling him the most dangerous, blah, 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 instead of being like, he literally, I don't know if he couldn't recognize or if he just couldn't admit that like this man was actually doing a lot of what he wanted him to do. Now, of course, Trump was actually disgusting. He did diminish the dignity of minorities, including Jews in this country, by talking about them in a disgusting way. Like, I don't deny that at all. But I think that there is a level at which he scrambled a lot of the previously held categories in American life. It used to be that like the Republicans were the party of the rich and the Democrats were the party of the working class, and then there was like this big social gap where the Democrats were, for, marriage equality, for example, and the Republicans were against it. A lot of those culture war battles have been won. And meanwhile, the Democrats had kind of moved to the center, even center right on economic issues, because their electorate, their base became college educated elites, right? And college educated elites want open borders because they want, cheap labor, right? They want people working in their homes for less money, right? So it's like there was that kind of collapse of the differences between the parties, where the left won a lot of cultural wars and the right won a lot of economic wars. And Trump showed up and was like, I am going to pick up that lefty protectionist economic platform and couple it with an anti-PC, retrograde, quasi-racist cultural front. And it was just this like winning. I mean, I will say I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of Trump supporters. There was only one who ever said to me that he liked the way that he talked, that he was in it for the braggadocious, gross language. Every single other one was like, I wish he would have been more dignified. And polling now shows that as well. But that idea of like a socially conservative, economically liberal, like that is the winning formula. That's what polls well. That's what Americans want. They want a $15 minimum wage and they want you to respect that they're religious. And instead you have the Republicans who have abandoned them economically and the Democrats who have abandoned them socially and now also economically. I forgot what the question was. I'm just talking and talking. I'm so embarrassed now.
Can I pick up on that? We had James Carville come out and say, everything the Democrats are doing around wokeness is not going to play well in elections. And I'm wondering if you think that might be an argument to wake up some of our fellow liberal Jews and say, what you're doing now may feel right in some sense, or maybe you think it's right, but it's going to have a backlash among your fellow countrymen who are going to look at this as elitism, and the person who lives in Steubenville, Ohio, who lost their job and whose father lost their job, it's been that long, does not like to be accused of white privilege. So so maybe it's time for you to reconsider whether this ideology is going to create social progress or going to actually do the exact opposite. Do you think that argument would work, or is an argument that you've given voice to as well?
I feel a little bit scared to say this, but I don't care who people vote for. I care about like the soul of this country. I don't think I care about morality, and I care about a public sphere where we treat each other with respect and where Jews don't have to fear for their lives, and where, Black people are not brutalized by the police. And I'm no longer convinced that the only way to get there is through a Democratic majority, Democratic capital D. I think Democratic lowercase d is extremely important. There are, like, for example, there are a whole bunch now of there's 4, okay, but there are 4 Republican senators who are on this, who are trying to pick up the Trumpism without Trump, like in the economic sense. And I don't know that if I looked deeply at their platform, I would say, oh, this is definitely worse for Jews than, Rashida Tlaib's imagined platform. So I don't feel attached to one party or the other winning. I know that's like a totally crazy, horrible thing to say because supposedly all of the Republicans are Nazis. But I just feel like I am not personally invested in the Jews being Democrats or Republicans. I'm invested in the soul of this country because it's been so good to us, and I owe it something for that. And because, you know, I believe that morality is important because I'm religious. So it's like that's sort of where my energy is. Now, 75% of Jews are still voting for Democrats. So you're saying, like, is there like would it be an incentive to get them on the anti-woke bandwagon to be like, you're going to lose the thing that you want? But to me, like, I feel like that's a political argument, and I'm a journalist, so I would never sort of think in those terms, if that makes sense.
One of the things that I've been seeing in the past week and a half are, you know, on social media, all of these proclamations by BLM and by other similar organizations on the progressive left, you know, essentially denouncing Israel and, you know, proclaiming their support for the Palestinian people. We all know that they're not mutually exclusive positions, right? You can support Israel, you can care for the Palestinians, but of course, nuance is always lost in these kinds of discussions on social media. But how do you, and I have my own thoughts about this, but I would rather hear you talk about how you see wokeness reframing the Israel-Palestine discussion.
Okay, so first of all, I feel a little bit like this is something I really don't understand about. I hear this a lot from liberal Jews, like, I want to support Black Lives Matter, but they say gross things about Israel, right? And I'm like, why do you feel the need to support Black Lives Matter? Like, you should support Black life. Like, you should support Black people not being brutalized by the police. But this is this organization is a political phenomenon that gave voice to that. Yeah, like, I'm really glad it exists. I think it played a really important, great, amazing role in, you know, American history. But like, why do you feel the need on social media to like associate with a specific iteration of caring about this topic? Like, go do something. I don't know, like, vote for somebody who's not gonna, you know, block Senator Tim Scott's police reform bill. I don't know, you know, go volunteer somewhere. Like, the idea that somehow like this, I'm so zerbrochen and zekrochen because I want to post this thing on my Instagram, but they also said this other thing. Like, I can't identify with that at all. Like, to me, that's so, it's just so weird. Like, but I hear that a lot, and I wish I understood it better because it would make me a better opinion editor and writer because I could address it. But I just feel very like alienated from that topic. Like, your job is to defend Black life. It's not to post about Black Lives Matter or to retweet Black Lives Matter. Like, that's a specific organization that, by the way, like we said before, doesn't actually represent where the Black community happens to be on this. Their call officially was to defund the police, and 81% of Black people oppose that. So I would say that. I think that's really important. And again, it comes from this like lack of like, it's both like a lack of moral authority, but also it's sort of like, you know, life is not on your social media feeds, you know, like it's kind of almost like you want to like post the things so you can move on with your life. And it's like, now you feel like, oh, I can't post this thing. I'm obviously not talking about you, Monica, but like in general, I hear this question a lot. Okay, now let me remember what the question was. Oh yeah, wokeness in Israel. Sorry.
Well, but if I could just jump in really quickly before you finish. I think part of it is that we've been conditioned or reconditioned to think of everything in binaries. I mean, we've talked about this before, racism and anti-racism. Everything has become an either or decision. And because Black Lives Matter as an organization looms so largely over American culture in general, we're either with it because they are the sole representative of Black lives, or we're against Black life. And that's the problem. It's this dichotomy, these dangerous dichotomies that are imposed on us over and over and over again.
I would recommend reaching out to Black pastors in the South, in the North, they're everywhere, because they're dealing with a very similar thing. Black Lives Matter is against the nuclear family, right? Which is, you know, opposition to the nuclear family is, you know, it's pretty much satanic when it comes to the church, right? Like, that's very, very, very bad. And so you actually have like a lot of Black pastors, Black Christians who are dealing with this exact same problem. Like, you know what I mean? Talk to them about it. Hear how they navigate this problem. They're not thrilled with everything that comes out of that organization. Some of them still support it. Some of them do not. They find other ways to stand up for the things that they believe in. It's kind of almost like saying like, well, how do I show my support for Israel? It would be like a Christian person saying, how do I show my support for Israel? If I don't want to be a member of like Christians United for Israel. It's like, well, there's a lot of other ways, a lot of other things you could do. Like, so I would say that in terms of what Black Lives Matter said about Israel, my understanding was that the first iteration in 2016 did call Israel, said it was committing a genocide against the Palestinians.
Right.
Yes.
That was the movement for Black Lives.
That was a movement for Black Lives. Right. And then this time around, they didn't have that language. Am I wrong about that?
No.
Yes, no, movement for Black Lives did not, after George Floyd, when they reconvened their policy platform group, did not issue a second statement, which we all anticipated they were going to do, that was going to once again condemn Israel. They didn't, I don't think that they actually issued a full-length statement like they did at all. So it did not just Israel was spared, but other issues as well. But there's Black Lives, see, that's why there's Black Lives Matter, which is a particular organization and this cause. And then there's the Movement for Black Lives, which is probably the most prominent subset of the Black Lives Matter movement. It includes many of the top thinkers and leaders.
They did not issue a statement, but it was still on the BLM website as of at some point last year. Because I went to search it. You had to, it used to be more prominent and then they buried it a little.
Okay.
And then I think it might not be there now, which is not to say they've changed their stance, but simply that they're becoming a little bit more savvy in terms of PR, maybe.
Yeah, I feel also like this whole language around like, it just, again, I feel like this is a problem that like if you sort of get out of the sort of highly educated, college educated bubble, it's sort of like it evaporates. If you're going to show up wearing a Jewish star or an Israeli flag to some soup kitchen, like nobody is going to be like, what are you, how dare you bring your genocidal values in here, and it's one of the reasons, I mean, it's not the only reason, but like, it's just, I keep coming back to this, like, I'm a real populist at heart. I find that especially in America right now, this sort of the education that is being provided, as you say, Monica, is very binary, Black versus white. It's completely enthralled to the anti-racist language, but much worse is how that's getting mainstreamed. And so in terms of like Israel, how I see it, it's I think well, as the piece that I wrote for Newsweek was called "When Wokeness Comes for Israel." So the anti-racist narrative is that there's sort of only two categories: racism and anti-racism, and there is the idea that it's a sort of racial essentialist model. Every topic is about racism and countering racism, right? Because if you are not actively countering racism at every moment, you are a racist. And who wants to be a racist, right? It's kind of one of the like weird ironies, is like built into it is this admission that we've actually improved as a society because nobody wants to be called a racist, right? Exactly. So you have this thing where every moment of every day, in every topic, in every area, you have to be finding the racial dynamic and then acting appropriately to elevate the people of color, and to check your privilege as a person, a white person. And you really see this binary being sort of imposed onto Israel. There were always people doing this, okay? It's not like that is new, right? The academy was always doing that, right? The lefties were always doing that. The activists were always doing that. But now it's been mainstream. Now the Washington Post and MSNBC are doing it, and members of Congress are doing it, right? Now it has been filtered down and mainstreamed very much over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, I don't remember an uptick in violence against Jews after the 2014 Gaza war. And so it's very shocking to see it. And it stems directly from the mainstreaming of the language of, ethnic cleansing, Israel is an apartheid, genocide. Why are they using these words? It's anti-racist language, right? It's woke language in which there's a racial binary being imposed on the Middle East. And of course, we know that anybody who knows anything about the Middle East knows that it's not a racial conflict, right? The majority of the Jews in Israel are the same, quote unquote, race as the Palestinians, right? They're Arab Jews. The majority of Jews living in Israel are Arab, right? They come from Arab countries. They belong to the Jewish nation, just like 20% of the Arabs who live in Israel belong to the Israeli nation, not the Jewish nation, but the Israeli nation. And then you have the Palestinians living in the West Bank and in Gaza who belong to they see themselves as part of a different nation. There is a national conflict happening there. And why am I insisting on that? Why is that such an important distinction, that it's not a racial conflict, but a national one? Well, first of all, because in racial conflicts, right, you have, when you have a white government oppressing Black people the way we did until the 60s and continue to in the form of police brutality and other ways, like you have a pure victim, a person who has been singled out for oppression based on the color of their skin, and a pure evil perpetrator, a white supremacist state that is oppressing them for no reason other than what they look like. Okay, you have pure evil and a pure victim. When you have a national conflict between two nations, right? People fighting over a border, let's say, right? Or two nations fighting over the same strip of land. You have two groups that both have agency, both have responsibility, both have taken action, both have like a real power, right? Now, their power is not equal. Israel at this point has much more power than the Palestinians do, either in Gaza, definitely than in the West Bank. And there is even a little bit of discrimination within Israel. So Israel has more power, and thus, because I'm still a lefty, I think they have more responsibility to solve the conflict, because that power gives them added abilities. It gives them more choices. Okay, that's what power is, right? But the idea that the Palestinians have no choices, that they aren't making choices every single day, it's just false. I mean, it's just not true. So yes, there were real civil rights abuses in the West Bank. Palestinians are subjected to state power by a government that they cannot vote for. That is a huge civil rights abuse. It's a huge problem, and it's an urgent problem. Palestinians living within Israel, Arab Israelis, they only have about 95% of the same rights as the Jewish Israelis. That's a real problem. Palestinians living under blockade in Gaza, a punishing blockade that is, there's no future for any child, any young person who lives there. It's a huge problem. Israel has 3 problems that it needs to solve. But the problem with the discourse here is it has flattened that out into Israel versus the Palestinians, white supremacist Jews versus people of color victims. And the problem with that is that unlike 3 problems that have 3 solutions, you have one problem, and the only solution that would solve all 3 of those problems would be to get rid of Israel, which is also never going to happen. And it's exactly like police brutality in America. By making this maximalist claim based on race, based on a thing that just does not exist there, you have made it impossible to solve the real and urgent problems. And so I am outraged. I am outraged about that. And then, of course, the most devastating thing that, not most devastating, second to the loss of human life, has been this resurgence of anti-Semitism. So that, idiots like me who have been saying anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism and there are forms of anti-Zionism that are not anti-Semites. It's like they're trying so hard to prove me wrong. And so what are we supposed to come back to our communities and say when these anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian protests are erupting in anti-Semitic violence?
Right. So let's ask one last question on that. You've just named one way that wokeness or woke ideology may give rise to anti-Semitism. Are you concerned about the relationship of this ideology and anti-Semitism? And if so, in what ways, in addition to the current round of attacks against Jews?
So, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, like, Hashem's got everything figured out. Like, I don't feel like I feel very worried for the soul of America, but I don't feel like, the Jewish people is about to not exist anymore. I hope that this country, I feel that we are going down the road of Europe, where to be a Jew is to be extremely marginalized. And I really hope that we are able to withstand that. So I wouldn't say that I feel like Jews are, like there's some, there are pogroms happening, but I hope they will peter out soon. And I don't feel, we are still, let me put it this way, we are still the luckiest Jews to ever have existed, like to ever have walked on planet Earth. We are still the safest Jews to ever have walked on planet Earth. And I don't think that's changing. But I definitely think that the woke language, so for example, the latest thing that I've been noticing is you have these Palestinian, it's always in the diaspora, by the way, Palestinians, when you meet them it's like never the same when you're talking to people who are actually living in the region, this, but, I've been seeing these activists saying, stop condemning anti-Semitism, like they're just trying to distract you with, and this whole situation with Rutgers, where the chancellor of Rutgers sent out an email saying, all bigotry is terrible. There's a rise in anti-Semitism. The death in Gaza was horrific, but let us stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters in our community. And he literally walked it back and had to apologize for condemning anti-Semitism. And to me, this thing where they are casting opposition to anti-Semitism as a form of racism, as a form of anti-Palestinian racism, that is a disaster, because essentially the skip from there to actually sanctioning anti-Semitism as a virtue signal is, to my mind, much too small. And at that moment, I mean, like if the Democrats are not able to stand up at that moment in the way that they have not been able to stand up all week and say, like, sorry, no, then I really feel at that point like it would be wrong to tell Jews to continue supporting that party. Why should Jews fight to be in the left when the left is fighting to kick them out? You know what I mean? It's sort of like, it's a weird thing to demand of people, but I do feel very much like the progressive left is trying to make Jews choose between progressive values and themselves, and every Jew should make that decision for themselves.
Well, this has been enlightening. I feel like we need to bring you back as sort of you have your finger on the pulse of these issues. You're covering them. You bring on also some writers that I haven't seen or heard of, and it's fascinating. And I really appreciate that about the Newsweek editorial pages. I'm reading writers that on these topics that I have yet to encounter before, and I think that's really helpful as well. And really appreciate what you're doing, what you and Newsweek are doing, and also offering a heterodox space for opinion. So thank you, and thank you for your role. Monica, any parting words?
No, this has all been great. Yeah, I think we could take it even further and keep talking about this for hours. But
so much for having me, you guys. It's been a real pleasure.